It's been a week of globetrotting for the Prime Minister and his cabinet as they seek to diversify on trade and security in the face of U.S. uncertainty. Mark Carney and some of his top ministers just wrapped up a tour through Poland, Germany and Latvia yesterday, and the International Trade Minister is still in South America on his trip to Brazil and Colombia. There's been lots of handshakes, but as these trips produce broad agreements without dollar values attached, what have they really done to secure Canada's trade future? Adam Chambers is the Conservative international trade critic, and he joins me now. Hi, sir. Thanks for coming on. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me here, JP.
So the Prime Minister signed agreements with Poland, Germany and Latvia during his swing through Europe. He's trying to open up new markets with the Canada-U.S. relationship on shaky ground. But the Conservatives, I take it, are not giving this trip very good reviews. Tell me why.
Well, look, I would say I've been around politicians long enough to judge them by what they do, not just by what they say. And, Mr. Carney ran during the election saying that Canada had to act faster than we've ever acted before. And yet, we're seeing lots of words. But as you mentioned in the lead in here, no dollar values, not a lot of substance in what we say. So while some people may find these actions promising, I think we'll reserve judgment until we actually see some substance and some meat on the bone.
Pierre Poilievre said yesterday that essentially nothing had been accomplished in Germany by the Prime Minister, but we saw that ruffled the feathers a little bit of the German ambassador. I don't know if you saw this, but he took to social media to gently chastise Mr. Poilievre, and he says that there was progress made in jointly developing Canada's critical minerals and that, that's, quote, far from nothing. What's your message to the Germans who are a little peeved?
Well, actually, I feel a little bit sorry for the Germans in that, it wasn't that long ago the Chancellor was over visiting former Prime Minister Trudeau, and we sent him home empty-handed, saying that there wasn't a business case for LNG. And now the Liberal government has flip-flopped on itself and reversed this decision. So in one way, I think it's encouraging that we're realizing that we should be selling LNG to Europe. But I recognize that the Germans are in a little bit of a difficult spot because not that long ago, this Liberal government had the exact opposite position that it seems to have today.
Yeah, of course. Prime Minister Trudeau saying there's no business case. I've had the German ambassador on this week. I've had the Polish ambassador on this week, and both said they are very much open to Canadian LNG. And the Prime Minister has changed his tune. At least this is a different kind of Liberal, if you will, because he says he's willing to supply an energy-hungry Europe with LNG. He says there are enormous opportunities to develop LNG in this country, a lot different than what we heard from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Are you happy about that about-face?
Well, look, as I said previously, I think we have to judge a government by its actions, and we haven't yet seen anything announced in terms of being able to deliver LNG to Europe. I mean, they're begging for it. In fact, they say they even buy discounted LNG through America. So, it's nice that we're hearing some things from the Liberal government that seem different than Prime Minister Trudeau, but we actually haven't seen much in the way of anything being delivered or concretely suggested that would give us some comfort that we're actually going to be able to secure these deals. And so that's what's important for us. Conservatives have been consistent for the last decade that we need to be selling our energy to the world, by the way, cleaner energy to the world. Canadian LNG is much cleaner than some LNG you can get in other parts of the world, and certainly much better than getting it from countries like Russia.
Mr. Poilievre also panned the Prime Minister's decision to lift some of the retaliatory tariffs last week. He says, if he was in charge, he would put in countermeasures on the Americans. Do you support hitting the U.S. with more tariffs?
Well, if we look at Mr. Carney's rhetoric during the campaign, and then we judge him by what his actions have been since the campaign, it's basically the complete opposite of what he promised Canadians during the campaign. He campaigned on, we'll have our elbows up, we're going to drop our gloves when someone challenges us. But every single decision that Prime Minister Carney has made since the campaign has been completely the opposite. He has given many concessions to the Americans, yet it is unclear whether we've gotten anything in return. Maybe that's why President Trump basically endorsed Mr. Carney during the campaign and said he didn't really like Pierre Poilievre that much because we would have been maybe more difficult to negotiate with.
But do you support tariffs? Do you think that's a prudent approach?
JP, I think you have to, we're not at the negotiating table currently. We don't know what's going on. Is it possible that the only way to get Americans talking to Canadians again was to reverse the tariffs? I'm not sure. But we have to look at the entirety of the deal when we do see a deal to judge Mr. Carney on whether he's able to secure one. I mean, Mr. Carney said he wanted the job. We had to hire he said, hire me, hire the Liberal Party, because we'll be able to negotiate to Donald Trump and stand up to him. Yet, his actions are not in keeping with that same promise.
As you have mentioned, there have been some concessions. We dropped the digital services tax. We did not match U.S. retaliatory tariffs on steel and aluminum and autos and lumber. And now we've just dropped the retaliatory tariffs on some of the other goods that we had in place. There have been concessions, and there hasn't been a deal. They blew past that August 1st deadline. There were some talks this week, but Dominic LeBlanc, the minister charged with negotiating this deal, left Washington earlier than planned. How soon does Mr. Carney have to come up with a deal to satisfy you, to show you that those concessions were worthwhile?
Well, to be fair to the government, negotiating with the Americans is not an easy task. They are, have picked battles and fights with many other countries. So, Mr. Carney has a tall task ahead of him. I do think, though, questions need to be asked about the extreme change in strategy. Was Mr. Carney even committed to tariffs in the first place? Did he mislead Canadians by saying he would have elbows up, knowing he was going to make concessions in the future? Or is this truly the only way that we could get the Americans talking to us again? But even if that is true, JP, we have to ask ourselves how we got here in the first place. Mr. Trump's actions and tariffs are unjustifiable and not in keeping with the spirit of NAFTA. That is the most important point. But the second is Liberals, senior Liberals who are still senior Liberal cabinet ministers, and even the Prime Minister himself and the former Liberal Prime Minister, have spent the last 10 years actually harming the relationship with Americans, antagonizing them. You just mentioned the digital services tax. There's the global minimum tax. There's the electric vehicle mandate, which, by the way, there is no possible way that our government is going to be able to continue that, not just because it's antagonizing to the Americans, but because it's just absolutely nonsense policy for Canadians here at home. And these are actions that the Liberals have taken that haven't just antagonized Republicans. And President Biden warned very starkly against imposing a global minimum tax before the rest of the world did, and a digital services tax. He warned Mrs. Freeland of that when she was the finance minister. She is still a senior minister in the Liberal government. The Democrats warned the Liberals that this would be a problem for the relationship. Republicans have warned the Liberals that this would be a problem for the relationship. And the only bipartisan consensus in America right now is that the Canadian relationship with the Americans has been strained. So I think, we have to be self-reflective about how we got here. We need to figure out a way to get out together. Conservatives have mentioned to Mr. Carney, we've offered our hand of support, whatever we can do to help secure a deal, by the way, that Mr. Carney promised he could get, we would be willing to do. But I think it's still fair to ask questions as we go through this process. Why are we reversing the strategy? How did we get here in the first place? And how do we get out of it together?
All right, let's leave it there. Adam Chambers is the conservative international trade critic. Appreciate your time, sir. Nice to see you.
Thanks, JP.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has returned from his European tour, part of his government's efforts to diversify Canadian trade beyond the U.S. But Conservatives say they're not seeing any concrete results from these actions and that Carney hasn't lived up to his campaign promises to Canadians.
He campaigned on, we'll have our elbows up, we're going to drop our gloves when someone challenges us. But every single decision that Prime Minister Carney has made since the campaign has been completely the opposite. He has given many concessions to the Americans, yet it is unclear whether we've gotten anything in return.
The Power Panel joins me now. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Hi, guys. Nice to see you all.
Hey, JP.
Amanda, jump in on that clip from Adam Chambers. What do you say to him?
Well, I mean, I think that the prime minister has been really clear, hasn't deviated one bit from the promise and commitment that he made to Canadians about strengthening and deepening the ties, diversifying the ties, the partnerships and relationships to rely less on the US. So while those talks continue with the US, his trip to Europe is really illustrative of the commitment that he's made. And that's to look at some of our strategic ties in areas like security, defense, trade, resource sectors, develop and build those global partnerships during this really shifting geopolitical dynamic and time. So, I mean, I think it's a small minded approach when you think that we should just take the lame duck. We should sit idly by and wait for the US trade negotiations with somebody who is completely unpredictable and not get out into the world and look at strengthening and deepening the ties the way that he has. And the proof is in the pudding. I mean, whether it's the security commitments in Ukraine or the deepened ties in Poland in trade, cybersecurity, clean energy, or looking at potential energy partnerships with Germany, like all of the things that happened this week was really illustrative and really promotes the commitment that he's made to Canadians.
Yeah, James, I take the point that we don't really have a lot of concrete details on what was accomplished this week, but it's not like nothing was accomplished. We certainly have a better relationship with Germany, Poland, and Latvia than we did at the start of the week, right? This trip was fairly successful from that point of view. And then if you're a proponent of liquefied natural gas, you have to be feeling better about the prospects of that in this country based on the comments from the Prime Minister and Tim Hodgson, the Natural Resources Minister. They're saying there's enormous possibilities there after meeting with the Europeans. What's your assessment of this trip?
True. The viability of LNG through northern Manitoba, though, is in question. But look, it was more than 10 years ago that Stephen Harper signed the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement, and it takes a long time to build economic ties across the Atlantic Ocean. You know, the United States works very well for us economically. We speak the same language. North-south infrastructure routes have existed for a long time, business supply chains, all that stuff. So you know, when we signed the Free Trade Agreement, as I said, more than a decade ago, we had a lot of interruptions. You know, Stephen Harper had a pretty aggressive plan to try to build those relationships with Europe, but they were interrupted by his defeat in 2015, by COVID in 2020, and Donald Trump's election in 2016, and then now his reemergence in 2024. So now this kind of, you know, a decade later, we're actually trying to get some benefits of that economic arrangement so that we can create Canadian jobs through world sales into the European market, which is a phenomenal opportunity for Canada. But Adam Chambers is right about the short-term reality that Canadians are starting to get increasingly anxious and nervous about the Canada-U.S. relationship. And the Prime Minister has an obligation to build out our relationship with Europe, and that's good. But I think Canadians are increasingly worried and anxious about what's going on with the United States and wanting to see some deliverables and some action. I imagine the Prime Minister will probably have some announcements very soon about some projects that are going to be good for the country. But this balance between the Canada-U.S. relationship, the Canada-Europe relationship, is a tough one for any Prime Minister to manage, but it's right for the opposition to raise appropriate questions.
Shachi, you did some polling in June, and it showed 64% of Canadians were very confident the Prime Minister could strengthen relationships with like-minded nations. Do you think that he delivered on those expectations this week?
Well, I think what Canadians expect now is some homework to be turned in, some things that demonstrate, you know, they were quite happy at the beginning of the summer, JP, to give him this summer to get a plan together. And that plan didn't just include oil and gas, but it did include that. It included diversifying and trying to find new trading partners. It talked about finding new markets for our resources. At his words, he wanted to build, baby, build. Oh, and there's that little thing called a budget that is still due. So, you know, it's like when you're in one of these, we're heading into back to school season, when you're in one of these, you know, masochistic over the summer English programs and your teacher gives you all the books, and now it's the last week of August and you're desperately trying to get all your book reports in. What is going to happen? I think we're going to start to see a little bit of softening in terms of where Canadians are at. There's still very much on the Prime Minister's side, but that is predicated more by an antipathy towards Donald Trump than it is by a sense that, yes, we have seen the proof points now and we're satisfied with what's being done. And it's really hard when you're in government because incremental work isn't always as satisfying as saying, here's the thing, it's all done, it's gift wrapped, it's delivered. So it's going to get more challenging for the Prime Minister as we come back and as Parliament resumes, and as you have a rejuvenated opposition leader who's going to really try to put the feet to the fire to the feet of the Prime Minister and basically say, hey, what have you done? And, we need to see more than words at this point. So, two things can be true at the same time. He has done some work, but at the same time, I think there's going to be pressure, a lot more pressure to see things completed.
Amanda, how do you feel about the state of Canada-U.S. talks? We know that Dominic LeBlanc, the U.S. Trade Minister, was in Washington. He had some productive conversations with his American counterpart. But he did leave a little early, right? He left on Wednesday instead of yesterday. Do you think that is a reason to be worried?
Well, I have the same information that we all have, and that was that the sources said that LeBlanc's meeting was supposed to be 60 minutes. It ended up being 90 minutes with Lutnick. They came out. There was this sense of optimism. They were really focused on sectoral tariffs that the U.S. has implemented, softwood, steel, aluminum, and everything that we heard coming out of it felt like things were headed in the right direction. So we can only take the word of those sources at this point. Obviously, Canadians are, I agree, anxious to get this deal done and looking ahead to the end of CUSMA and that entire trade negotiation. But I think that it's promising that the talks are ongoing, that our Canadian officials are coming back with a sense of optimism and conveying that to Canadians. I think that there's no reason to not believe that that's the course that we're headed in.
Yeah, James, our sources usually describe these meetings as productive. There was a new way to describe it yesterday. They called it, they're leaving Washington with prudent optimism about where things are at with the Americans.
Hey Siri, find a parallel word for progress. Look, they're talking. That's good. Doors aren't being slammed. That's good. They have a cordial relationship. That's good. But we are now 7 months into the Trump presidency, which is to say we have 41 months left. And sort of managing this relationship and actually having continued dialogue is actually a good thing. I think that the relevant strategy for this government is probably to play the long game and just to manage the Trump administration and all of its complexities and all of its sort of erratic behavior over the long term. And I think that Dominic LeBlanc being down there and meeting with folks is a good thing. And so, tomorrow you may have breaking news on a headline that things have gone completely pear-shaped. I don't know. It's the nature of the Trump presidency. But I think as long as there's dialogue, as long as it's courteous, and as long as it seems to be, substantive and not sort of ad hominem, I think that's a win.
Shachi, quick final thoughts to you on this one before we switch topics.
Nothing more than I guess we're going to see. And, we don't know any more than we're going to find out. And at that point, Canadians will be able to judge what they think about the performance so far.